I'm just going to keep reminding you, we are 29 days out until Election Day, so there's a lot to talk about. And with that, just about 4 years since Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. And still, so many Republicans can't bring themselves to answer a very straightforward question.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
Can you say definitively here and now that Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election?
Kristen, Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. It was an unfair election in many ways.
But did Trump lose?
Joe Biden was elected, Kristen.
Do you just not want to say that Trump lost?
Can you say unequivocally that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost?
See, this is the game that is always played by mainstream media with leading Republicans. It's a gotcha game. You want us to litigate things that happened 4 years ago when we're talking about the future.
It's not a gotcha question. It's a pretty easy one. Because these questions about 2020 are a clear test of how willing these Republicans will be to help Trump in his efforts to mess with this election. It's actually not a question about the past. It's very much a question about the future. And their answers kind of tell us everything we need to know. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman of New York. Congressman, it's great to see you. I have to start with what Mike Johnson just said. I mean, the question of whether Donald Trump lost is a gotcha game. That's what he said, which is obviously not a hard question. But I raise this because, to me, it's a reminder of what they're capable of doing another time around. But what do you say to that, and how did you hear it?
I heard it exactly as you did, Jen, which is that Mike Johnson, who is the architect of a brief filed in the Supreme Court by a number of House members, Republican House members, trying to overturn the election, it refuses to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. And why is that important? It's important because, first of all, it's a litmus test for Donald Trump as to whether or not he will, A, choose someone for vice president, which J.D. Vance clearly had to pass and must continue to pass. But also, Mike Johnson could be the Speaker of the House if the Republicans maintain the majority. He will control the gavel on January 6th. So it matters a lot what Mike Johnson thinks about the last election when 60 judges said there was no fraud. Bill Barr resigned because there was no fraud and he was getting pressured as Attorney General to say there was fraud. And it is unequivocal and unquestionable that Donald Trump lost. But they cannot say it. And what that means is that they will be happy to say the same big lie once again in 2024 if the opportunity presents itself. And we know that it will because Donald Trump is already saying that.
History repeats. It's important to be clear-eyed about it. Speaker Johnson also, I was just talking to Secretary Mayorkas about the hurricanes and hurricane recovery, and there's, of course, another one coming to the coast of Florida, expected to come to the coast of Florida. Speaker Johnson has said that despite the damage, Congress can wait to reconvene and vote on boosting federal disaster relief funding. He says it'll take some time to assess the damage. That part might be fair, but lawmakers now aren't scheduled to return to session until November 12th. I mean, are you concerned about it? Can Congress wait?
I am concerned about it. We passed an additional $20 billion of funding for FEMA in the continuing resolution in September, and so there's some money for immediate needs. But what the Republicans refuse to acknowledge is that because of climate change, FEMA has 3 times as many devastating natural disasters as they had about 15 years ago. And so their funds need to be plussed up accordingly, and they're not because the Republicans refuse to do it. So the reason why FEMA doesn't have enough money in the Natural Disaster Relief Fund, which is, of course, entirely separate from the Shelter and Services Program, which is the one that reimburses localities for some of their immigration costs, predominantly in Republican states. But that's a totally different bucket of money, and FEMA doesn't have enough because the Republicans refuse to give enough, and now they're not allowing us to come back to make sure that the Americans suffering from Helene and potentially from Milton coming can actually get the help that they need.
It's really hard to understand, I think I'll say. I wanted to ask you, Congressman, you
well,
were
it's not that hard to understand when they have an election and
very
they'll lie
diplomatic of
until
me.
they...
I agree. As I just said earlier, yes, you were less diplomatic in a good way. I wanted to ask you, Congressman, I mean, you were in Israel. Today's, of course, the anniversary of October 7th. You were in Israel with your family during Hamas's horrific attack. I still remember watching the interview you did with my colleague, Rachel Maddow, around that. 1,200 people were killed. More than 250 were taken hostage. How are you reflecting on that day 1 year later?
Well, I'm going to be honest, it's been a really hard day. Certainly flashbacks to what was going on with me in Tel Aviv as rockets were raining on down on us and my family and my 3 little kids. But it pales in comparison to just seeing hostage families as I have today, the Nutra family from Long Island, whose son Omer remains a hostage 1 year later. And just imagining the pain and the anguish and the fact that Israel, because there are 101 hostages who were illegally abducted and remain illegally in captivity in the dungeon tunnels of Gaza by a brutal terrorist group, Israel cannot move on until those hostages are home. And the frustrating part, of course, is not only that it's been a year since they were abducted, but that what we're seeing in New York City here and elsewhere is a rise in violent protest and calls for violence. People just outwardly waving Hamas and Hezbollah flags, supporting terrorist groups funded by Iran who not only want to erase Israel and all Jews, but chant death to America. And yet that is just growing here in our own country. And I think that every American needs to take stock of what's going on and what this fight is really about, because it truly is democracy versus terrorism and tyranny. And it is much bigger than Israel and Hamas, although Hamas needs to be eradicated, just like all of the other 6 Iranian-backed militias and terrorist groups who are attacking Israel and surrounding them. So it's been a very emotional day. I was in Central Park for a really moving ceremony, a commemoration with some excellent speakers and videos. And it just breaks your heart to see the families of these victims, the families of these hostages who were so brutally murdered in an unprovoked sneak attack on October 7th last year.
So much pain being felt by so many of these families, and obviously, of course, the tens of thousands of families, more than that, who have lost loved ones in Gaza in the years since. Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you.